One insurance company had sold protection on $500 billion of debt, and a law passed in 2000 made it illegal for any regulator to touch those contracts. The company was AIG. The contracts were credit default swaps. Almost nothing was set aside to cover them. You already know the story of 2008, reckless borrowers, a housing bubble that had to burst, a storm no one saw coming. That's the version in the textbooks and the one the people in charge still prefer. But the story you were told leaves out the part that mattered most. Subprime was a spark. What turned that spark into a global fire was a machine larger than the banking system itself, and a choice made by name years before the crash. If subprime was one corner of the mortgage market, how did it burn down the world? We are still paying for it. Start with what everyone agrees on. In the autumn of 2008, the housing market collapsed. The banks that bet on it fell too, and the world nearly followed. The men in charge had their story ready. A 100-year flood no one could have seen coming. That October, Greenspan told Congress he'd found a flaw in his model of the world, but that was the version written by the people who needed it to be true. Now picture a trading floor in London, not a bank, an insurer. Inside AIG, a small unit sold insurance on debt, credit default swaps. If a bundle of mortgages soured, AIG paid. Until then, it kept the premium as profit. The premium was profit. The promise was a fuse. By 2007, that unit had guaranteed over $500 billion of assets, $78 billion tied straight to mortgage bonds, with almost nothing set aside. Its boss, Joseph Cassano, told investors he couldn't imagine losing a single dollar. No regulator was allowed to check. The public heard none of it. As the crack showed in 2007, the Fed and Treasury called subprime contained one bad corner of the market. The papers agreed. Savers read it over breakfast and slept fine. If it was only subprime, how did it take down everything else? To answer that, look past the mortgage to what Wall Street stacked on top of it. Those loans were bundled into bonds, the bonds sliced into new bonds, and the tower was funded overnight in a market called Repo, where firms sell assets at night and buy them back at dawn just to raise cash. By mid-2008, that market had passed $10 trillion, a second banking system grown in the dark, as large as the one we regulate. The mortgage was never the point. The machine on top of it was, and most of it was borrowed. If the deals struck in rooms you were never shown are the history you want more of, subscribe. The sharpest turn is still ahead. A regulator who described this exact disaster a decade early, and the men who buried the warning. One trick kept it running. For a pension fund or a foreign bank to buy this paper, it had to be safe. Officially, legally safe. That blessing came from the rating agencies. Moody's and Standard & Poor's stamped tens of thousands of these securities AAA, the grade reserved for government debt. And here was the rot. The agencies were paid by the very banks whose products they graded. The Crisis Commission later called them essential cogs, without whom none of it could have sold. So what happens to a $10 trillion market when the safe collateral isn't safe? Here the simple story, greed and nothing else, starts to crack. It wasn't only greed. For years the world had been drowning in savings. Money poured in from exporting nations and oil states hunting a safe return, driving rates toward the floor. Everyone reached for yield, from a Norwegian town treasurer to an American pension fund, and American mortgages were where it lived. A global hunger, not one villain, and some saw where it led. In 2005, before a room of the world's most powerful central bankers, the economist Raghuram Rajan warned that finance's incentives were building toward a catastrophic meltdown. Lawrence Summers called it Luddite. The room moved on. Rajan wasn't alone. A year later, Nouriel Roubini warned the International Monetary Fund a housing bust was coming, that confidence would crack and the system freeze. The audience laughed. But there had already been a real fight over this exact danger 10 years earlier. Which brings us to the number that quietly demolishes the official story. It doesn't come from a critic. It comes from Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve through the whole crisis. Afterward, in speeches and testimony, he laid out the arithmetic. The entire stock of subprime mortgages in 2007 was well under $1 trillion. The losses, when they landed, ran to a few hundred billion. One New York Fed estimate put them near $300 billion. Against global markets, he said, that was modest, less than the world's stock markets can shed on a rough day. The dot-com crash had erased some $8 trillion in paper wealth, more than 20 times as much for only a mild recession. So sit with it. The classroom says a housing crisis destroyed the world economy. The Fed chairman says the housing losses were far too small to do that alone. If the fuel was that small, who built the bomb? The bomb was how the money was borrowed. In September 2008, a giant money market fund, the Reserve Primary Fund, $65 billion inside it, admitted its shares had slipped below $1. It had broken the buck. Investors raced to pull nearly $40 billion out, and the fear leapt from firm to firm. This was a bank run with no line out the door. It ran on screens, in markets the public had never heard of, financial firms fleeing other financial firms. The economist Gary Gorton put it simply, people saw only the effects, the falling prices, the foreclosures, and mistook them for the cause. Some think he overstates it. Few dispute what came next. It came for AIG. On September 15, 2008, the agencies downgraded the insurer, and every one of those unregulated swaps triggered a collateral call it couldn't pay. Bernanke called AIG a hedge fund running on unregulated products. The next day, the government seized it, $85 billion for a 79% stake, and the rescue grew to $182 billion. Then the part no one advertised, roughly $62 billion of that public money passed straight through AIG to the banks on the other side of its bets, Goldman Sachs, Societe Generale, Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, paid in full. The public was told it was saving an insurer. The ledger says it was covering Wall Street's losing bets. And someone had made sure years earlier those bets could never be regulated. Picture a different room in 1998. Brooksley Born, who chaired the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, looked at these exact derivatives, private, unwatched, growing fast, and proposed something simple. Regulate them. She warned in writing that an unregulated market like this could pose grave dangers to the economy. Alan Greenspan, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, and his deputy Lawrence Summers moved to stop her, and Congress stripped her agency of its power. Her aide Michael Greenberger later recalled Summers phoning to say 13 bankers in his office warned her plan would trigger the worst financial crisis since the Second World War, a line that survives only as Greenberger's memory, never on paper. Born left in 1999. In 2000, Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, signed by President Clinton, placing these derivatives beyond nearly all oversight. The Crisis Commission later called it a key turning point toward the crash. The warning was the letter. The law was the answer. The catastrophe wasn't unforeseeable. It was foreseen, named, and deregulated on purpose. Even inside the doomed firms, the truth was staged. When Lehman Brothers failed, its court-appointed examiner, Anton Valikas, produced a 2,200-page report and found a maneuver Lehman's own people called an accounting gimmick. Using a trick nicknamed Repo 105, Lehman pushed some $50 billion of assets off its books at each quarter's end, just long enough to report less borrowing than was real. It held roughly $700 billion in assets on $25 billion of its own money, 30-1, and rolled billions through Repo daily to survive. The statement said one thing, the book said the opposite. Then the bill came due for everyone who never touched a swap. The collapse spread from the screens to the streets. Foreclosures, retirement savings gutted, between 8 and 9 million American jobs gone. And because the machine was global, the Federal Reserve became the planet's lender of last resort, opening emergency dollar lines to 14 foreign central banks, swaps that peaked near $583 billion, about a quarter of everything on the Fed's books. Picture a family loading a car in the driveway on one end of that wire, and a European bank drawing American dollars at 3 in the morning on the other. Built upstream, paid downstream. So what was it really about? Not the mortgage, that was only the surface. Underneath ran a principle. When a financial system grows in the dark, private profit and public loss stop being an accident and become the design, and the people who write the rules, and the people who profit from their absence keep turning out to be the same. The Commission's verdict was blunt, avoidable, the warnings ignored. Hold the honest complication beside it. The savings glut was real. There were other triggers, and some of the Commission's own members dissented, blaming federal housing policy and the mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, a case the majority rejected and historians still argue over. It was never just one thing. It was a system built so no one ever had to be. That's the part that should keep you up. The machine didn't shrink. The shadow banking system that turned a modest loss into a global fire is now larger than the regulated banks. By the end of 2024, the world's non-bank finance had reached $257 trillion, more than half of every financial asset on Earth, growing at twice the pace of ordinary banking, its fastest growth in private credit, a corner regulators admit they cannot fully see. The dollar lines improvised in 2008 became permanent and fired again in 2020. In 2025, the failures of a subprime auto lender and an auto parts maker rattled credit markets again. Small triggers, opaque pipes, the same shape. The choice made in 2000 didn't stay in the past. It's still running the system you live in, only bigger and just as hard to see. If you value the parts of history that quietly shape the present, subscribe and hit like. It genuinely helps these get made. Then tell me below, which mattered more, the borrowers everyone blames or the machine built on top of them and hidden from view? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.